Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robin Crabtree. I'm the Dean of the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts here at Loyola Marymount University. And it's always my honor and delight to offer a welcome on behalf of LMU's administration, as well as on behalf of the faculty and staff of BCLA to all participants in events like today's. Welcome everyone to our intellectual community. We're so grateful that you're choosing to engage with our Irish Studies program in general and with this program today. Our Irish Studies program has been in the forefront of partnering with LA's substantial Irish and Irish American communities, with the Consulate and other related organizations, such as our friends who organize Ireland Week each year. I want to welcome Orla Keane, the Irish Consul General here in LA's new and second West Coast headquarters of the Irish Consulate, or should I say new and now first? Well, anyway, I think they can battle that out for prominence. It's also my distinctive honor and pleasure to welcome back to LMU the Honorable Daniel Mulhall, who has been Ireland's ambassador to the United States since 2017, and who gave a standing room only tour de force lecture on the Brexit on our campus soon after he assumed that post. He previewed then some of the many complications Brexit poses for Ireland, not the least of which is the situation on its northern border and Northern Ireland's shifting status vis-a-vis the UK, all fraught issues given the productive shifts that membership in the EU had enabled. It was such an amazing conversation. And Ambassador, we're still talking about it. It comes up in conversation a lot around here. Now, today's program on the 100th anniversary of the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations calls us to the contemplation of historical injustices and oppressive regimes linked to colonialism and its attendant subjugation of the Irish population. Yet this year and this week in particular, we cannot help but link this history to our own legacies of colonialism and subjugation here in the United States, and the ways these continue to be replicated in structural and systemic inequities and injustices. I'm grateful to the Irish Studies program, which, among other ways of creating spaces for dialogue on critical issues and scholarly work on Ireland, has endeavored, in conjunction with our Bellarmine Forum thematic focus this year on transformative justice, to produce what was a few weeks ago a truly extraordinary discussion on police reform that linked questions of violence in Belfast and other urban centers in Northern Ireland with the violence in our streets and the implication of law enforcement bodies in perpetuating this violence. That dialogue among reformers from Ireland and Los Angeles with scholars of these issues was rich and powerful and inspirational for our students and for all in attendance. Thank you again to the Irish Studies Program Director, Professor Dermot Ryan, along with all the faculty who advise and guide Irish Studies here at LMU, and to our panelists, Professor Amy Woodson-Bolton of our History Department, Father Oliver Rafferty, our visiting Jesuit scholar this year, Professor Catherine Mcclurkin from Western Kentucky U and their History Department, and of course, again, to Consul Keane and Ambassador Mulhall. Enjoy the event.
Thank you, Robin, not only for your kind words of welcome, but for your continued support of Irish Studies here at LMU. As the Director of Irish Studies, the Irish Studies Programme, I want to add my welcome to all of you here today to this forum on the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations. Once we have heard from the speakers, we hope to have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions for the speakers, please feel free to post them in the chat, and please make sure to keep your video muted. Today's conversation is part of A Farther Shore, a series of American reflections on the advent of Irish independence. and we are greatly honoured to be collaborating with the Embassy of Ireland and the Consul General in Los Angeles on this event. Now, if I were to take time to thank everybody who helped organise this panel, we wouldn't have a panel. But I must take a moment to thank our distinguished Consul General of Ireland to the Western United States, Orla Keane. You will have an opportunity to hear some closing reflections from Consul General Keane, but I want to take a moment now to thank her and her team for their continued collaboration. Like all of you, I am eager to hear from our speakers, so I'll keep my remarks brief. Today's conversation, as Dean Crabtree suggests, comes at a critical moment in the history of Ireland, Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. We're still processing the impact of Brexit, and there's genuine talk about a border poll and a united Ireland. At the same time, all of us have been watching with dismay the violence in cities across the north over the last several weeks. Those of us, like me and a number of the speakers who came of age during the Irish Troubles, watched these images with a distressing sense of familiarity. And yet our goal today is to avoid offering the familiar and comforting narratives that would explain away these events or simplify their logic. Since taking over as the Director of Irish Studies, it has been my goal to bring fresh thinking to our understanding of Ireland and the role an Irish Studies program can play in an Irish, but also an American context. To that end, and Dean Crabtree referred to this, our program has been actively engaging and forging collaborations between activists and scholars in Northern Ireland and in Los Angeles to discuss police reform. In the coming academic year, our program will offer events on Frederick Douglass's time in Ireland and his engagement with the Irish American community on his return to the United States. We also plan to explore the role of Irish immigrants and the Irish American community in the development of Los Angeles. And today, our speakers will attempt to offer us new ways of thinking about the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations. And so without further ado, let me introduce our distinguished panel and respondent. Our first speaker this afternoon is my colleague and former chair of the history department here at LMU. I thought she was still the chair, Amy Woodson-Bolton. Dr. Woodson-Bolton teaches widely on British, Irish, imperial, and global history, and has published on the history of museums, the social role of art, and the history of anthropology. And her current book project is focusing on origins and anthropology. Amy will open today's discussion by situating the treaty within the context of not only the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland, which we should remember was the sovereign state that existed at the time of the negotiations, but also the British Empire more broadly. This frame reminds us that if the Republican movement in Ireland viewed its struggle as a war of independence, loyalists in the south and the north of Ireland, as well as the British mainland, viewed these developments as secessionist, with momentous implications for the future of Great Britain and its empire. Our second speaker, Dr. Oliver Rafferty, is a Jesuit priest hailing from Belfast, whose dissertation on the Church, the State, and the Fenian threat was completed under the supervision of Roy Foster at Oxford. Dr. Rafferty has authored and edited numerous books on 19th and 20th century history, Irish history, and at present, Dr. Rafferty is Professor of Modern Irish and Ecclesiastical History at Boston College. And it is my distinct honor and pleasure to add my voice to Dean Crabtree and welcome him today as LMU's visiting Jesuit scholar for the coming academic year. Dr. Rafferty will offer a nuts and bolts discussion of the treaty negotiations themselves, touching on the ceasefire in December 1920, the selection of the Irish delegation, the conduct of the negotiations, Lloyd George's famous threat of renewed war, the treaty and the 6 counties, and the attitude of the Catholic Church to the treaty and the partition, all in a hard 15 minutes. Our final speaker is Dr. Catherine Mcclurkin, a professor of public history at Western Kentucky University, whose research deploys material culture to expand the narrative of contested histories in museums, specifically in Northern Ireland. Dr. Mcclurkin will contextualize and comment on the politics, challenges, and opportunities of commemorating the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty and the politics of commemoration in Ireland more generally. Finally, we are honored to welcome back to LMU the Irish ambassador to the United States, Daniel Mulhall, as today's respondent. Ambassador Mulhall's previous postings were in Kuala Lumpur, Berlin, and more recently, London. Born and raised in the great city of Waterford, Ambassador Mulhall studied history and literature at University College Cork, but I won't hold that against him. I had to say that as a dub and a Trinity graduate. He has lectured and published widely on Irish history and literature. Honorary President of the Yeats Society, Ambassador Mulhall is devoted to Irish literature, a man after my own heart, and for more than 6 years has tweeted a verse of Irish poetry each and every day. And I can say on a personal note, my sister, who follows you, really appreciates that and is constantly forwarding them to me. And now, without further ado, I will turn the spotlight over to Dr. Amy Woodson-Bolton.
Wonderful. All right, so I'm hoping this is all going to work. After a year on Zoom, it's always a little bit exciting to make everything go. All right. So I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited to try to talk about the many things that I would like to talk about, but I also want to make sure I set my timer to stay in time. So as Dermot said, I'm going to try and put the Treaty of 1921 into some bigger context. Part of what I want us to think about is the fact that the Treaty of 1921 actually happened at the height of the British Empire, and the British Empire was in the midst of expanding rather than contracting in the time after World War I. So I'm going to try and cover what was the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, and very briefly, a kind of big picture of what led to it. How does the treaty relate to British imperialism? And what does all this have to do with Brexit? And I think more broadly, what I'm really interested in kind of digging at today is the complexity of identity. So thinking about Irish history and thinking about the way that Irish history has created overlapping and often competing identities. The Irish in Ireland, in the United Kingdom, in the British Empire, and of course then also in Europe. But that there is no single Ireland and there's no single Irish history. So what was the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921? On the most basic level, it was the treaty that created the border that is the arrow is pointing to right now, that created Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and then the Irish Free State. But when we think about what led to that moment, obviously you could start the story in any number of places, but I actually want to start where Professor Ryan started, which is the Act of Union in 1800. In that Act of Union, the Irish Protestant Parliament dissolved itself and created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And that was a single entity ruled from the Parliament in London. Over the next over 100 years, there were multiple movements to try to achieve Irish independence and self-government. Some of those were constitutional, some of those were revolutionary models. There were multiple different and often competing movements to achieve Irish self-government. But the one that ended up really taking hold in a number of different ways, and with numerous political ramifications for the Liberal Party in Britain, and of course for the Unionists in Ireland, as well as the nationalist movement, was the Home Rule movement. And this was to give Ireland self-government. The first bill was brought before the British Parliament in 1886, but it didn't pass until 1913. In what many historians kind of see as typical Irish luck, it received the royal assent in 1914, and with the idea that it would become law in 1915, but it was delayed by World War I. In the years as Home Rule gained momentum, we see responses to that in Northern Ireland in particular, with a kind of hardening or a militarization of unionist and nationalist identities in response to one another. So I think this picture in a way says it all. Here's a picture of the Unionist leader, Sir Edward Carson, in 1912. We will not have home rule. People in Northern Ireland who were absolutely committed to the Union. And of course, there were people in Southern Ireland who felt that way as well. But this did not remain a political decision. This turned into paramilitary forces. And of course, part of a broadening wave of militarization across Europe in the years leading up to World War I that very much contributed to the war itself. So here's the Ulster Volunteer Force, formed in 1913, and you can see them drilling here with sticks. The Irish Volunteers formed in the same year. Here they are on the way to attend O'Donovan Ross's funeral in Dublin. In the war, though, the Irish Volunteers, the nationalists split. Some supported the idea of fighting for the Union forces on the British side. Hundreds of thousands volunteered for the Empire and for Ireland, for the rights of small nations, the sense that actually Belgium was a small nation just like Ireland. And in fact, that was part of why Britain was in the war. That was certainly the message of why you should sign up. In the middle of all that, as many people here will know, came the Easter Rising of 1916. Nationalists frustrated with home rule stalling, tired of waiting, tired of the interminable war that didn't seem to be helping them at all. This was not a very popular rising, and indeed, as with many revolutionaries before them, that idea of lighting a spark and having a massive revolutionary movement did not happen. However, the British response with the summary execution of 15 rebels did provoke a response and largely turned the public opinion, at least, against the British response. And you can see that in some ways reflected in the elections of 1918, when Sinn Féin, the nationalist political party, won a majority of the British MPs to go to London. What happened, though, next is that they set up their own parliament. They just said, okay, we're going to do it. We've been waiting long enough. So they set up the Dáil Éireann in 1919. What followed then, known as the Anglo-Irish War, was a guerrilla war, and you may recognize Michael Collins here, who set up the Irish Republican Army, a guerrilla war between the Irish Republican Army and the Royal Irish Constabulary to support the forces trying to prevent this war and trying to keep Ireland as part of the Union, came what were known as the Black and Tans. And these were often, these were war veterans. They had been hardened by years of fighting in the trenches. And from their point of view, they really saw these upstart fighters for Irish freedom as traitors. They saw them as going against everything they had just been fighting for in the trenches. There was a great deal of brutality. Eventually, a kind of stalemate was reached, and this led to the negotiations, which included, and this is what we're going to hear from Professor Rafferty, the question of partition and the relationship between whatever self-governing Irish state was going to come about and the Crown and the broader Union. So that's the kind of setup for the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921. But then what was happening in the broader British Empire and the question of British imperialism more generally? While this was all happening, the treaties of Versailles and Sèvres were being negotiated. And what this meant was actually significant territorial expansion of the British Empire. So again, we can think about the kind of independence movements that were gaining ground in India, in Ireland, the kind of speaking out against imperialism. And yet, this moment in between the wars, as I said, was actually a moment when the French and British empires expanded. Some of this came out of the pact between the secret agreement between the French and the British, known as Sykes-Picot of 1916, which basically they agreed that should they win the war, they would split apart the pieces of the Ottoman Empire, which was a German ally. And also, of course, came about through the Treaty of Versailles, by which German colonies ended up going to Britain and France of League of Nations mandates. In the Treaty of Sèvres, ultimately, Ottoman territories, again, did go to Britain and France as League of Nations mandates. And let me just show you, I'll show you what that looked like. But, one of the things, again, when we think about Irish identity, many Irish came to identify as having been colonized by the British, but it's worth remembering that many Irish, hundreds of thousands of Irish people participated in British imperialism as officers in the British Army and Navy, allowing them to emigrate. It's a far more complex picture, I think, when we look at the picture as a whole. So the League of Nations mandates in here you can see the Treaty of Sèvres, and then again the Treaty of Versailles, the German colonies. And so this is, you can just get a sense, the orange territories here: Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq going to Britain, Syria and Lebanon going to France. Here you see, this is Africa in 1914, but you can see the German colonies that would end up going as League of Nations mandates as part of the Treaty of Versailles. And so here is kind of a general map of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland after these treaties. And one of the things to notice is, so here is, and this map does not really give you a good sense of the tininess of Britain and Ireland relative to the territories that they were controlling. The argument for why Ireland should stay part of the Union since the late 19th century had been, you want to be part of the imperial parliament, right? That had been the unionist argument. So what does all this have to do with Brexit? Well, here is some recent graffiti against the idea of a border between Britain and Northern Ireland. No Irish sea border, Ulster sold out. But it's also worth thinking about the ways that in Brexit negotiations, many of those in favor of Brexit, in favor, that is, of taking Britain out of the European Union, had talked about the British Commonwealth actually in terms of a kind of Empire 2.0. And by that, they meant we don't need trade agreements with Europe. We are going to use trade agreements with our dominions and our former colonies. So there really was this incredible resurgence of this sense of Britain as being able to be independent, but again, independent of Europe, really in as much as it could fall back on the former empire. Now, we don't have time to go through all of this, but one of the things I want to point out is that over the course of the 20th century, as again, you will all be familiar with, the tensions and the violence in Northern Ireland as the Catholic minority, the minority within Northern Ireland, sought civil rights, and that was very much a civil rights movement of the 1960s, very much in line and predicated and based on civil rights movements across and anti-colonial movements around the world. That movement led to 30 years of violence and several thousand deaths. But what's remarkable, of course, was the Good Friday Agreement that led to power sharing. Many political scientists and historians understand that that was possible in many ways because of happening under the umbrella of both Ireland and Britain being part of Europe. So then we reach this moment now with the Brexit vote in 2016 and the Northern Ireland Protocol being enacted at the start of this year. So what does that mean? Why is that important? The Northern Ireland Protocol is specifically to avoid creating a land border here, that old 1921 land border, right, between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and instead creating a checkpoint here between mainland Britain and Northern Ireland. And this, in combination with the pandemic, in combination with all kinds of rising tensions, has led to the recent violence. I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we can get more questions if people want more details. But hopefully that's given a kind of very quick whistle-stop tour of some of these issues. I will stop sharing and hand over the spotlight and the mic to my colleague, Oliver Rafferty.
So thank you very much indeed. I have the I suppose, enviable task or unenviable task of giving a kind of a rather boring presentation, frankly, about the nuts and bolts of the treaty, unlike Amy and Katie, who are giving a sort of much more kind of innovative, interpretive approach. And therefore, I may not fulfill Dermot's mandate that we should bring fresh ideas to our understanding of the treaty. I want to begin in December of 1920, when Archbishop Patrick Clune of Perth, Australia, conversed with David Lloyd George in London. Clune, although he was an Irishman, born in Ireland, brought up in Ireland, was very pro-British. He was in favour, for example, of conscription in Australia during the First World War. That didn't happen. But as a result of his conversations with Lloyd George, he brought to Dublin proposals for a ceasefire, even at that stage. He conversed with Griffith, he conversed with Collins, but Lloyd George, in the meanwhile, had been convinced by his military advisors that it was possible for the British to win the war against the IRA. So what Lloyd George got in July of 1921, he could have had in December of 1920, but he decided he didn't want it because he took the military advice on the matter. But in the spring of 1920, the British cabinet had already been told that the war in Ireland was costing £20 million a year. This enormous amount of money at that particular point, especially in the context of the fact that Britain had engaged enormous debts as a result of the First World War. I mean, it owed £1 billion to the American government and American institutions, £1 billion rather, to the American government and institutions, and $1 billion to Canada, and all sorts of other debts as well. So that the fact that it's prosecuting the war in Ireland, costing it a lot of money. And it is precisely a concern about the military situation, which is uppermost in the minds of the cabinet, indeed, of the army itself. It was estimated that from the point of view of the army, it would need a minimum of 40,000 soldiers to contain the war in Ireland. In fact, in 1919, there were 57,000. But by January of 1920, that was reduced to 34,000. And that is about 10% of the whole of the British Army at that particular point. And as Amy has pointed out, this is in the context whereby Britain is expanding its empire, so it needs soldiers all over the empire, and yet Ireland is occupying a full 10% of the army at that stage. When General Macready was appointed General Officer Commanding, he determined that, in fact, we really need 100,000, and almost a third of the army, if the situation in Ireland is to be contained. And it's precisely in that context that the Black and Tans were invented, the auxiliaries were invented, and interestingly enough, the auxiliaries were the highest paid police force in the world at that particular time. The immediate background for the ceasefire was the speech that King George V gave at the opening of the Belfast Parliament in June of 1921, where he invited all Irishmen to extend the hand of friendship, to begin a process of reconciliation in Ireland. It has to be said that this speech had a greater impact on nationalists in the 26 counties than it had in the nationalists in the 6 counties. Nevertheless, Lloyd George, taking advantage of that speech, then wrote to De Valera on the 24th of June, inviting De Valera to come to London to arrange, first of all, to arrange a ceasefire in advance, and then come to London to discuss a settlement of the Irish question. Again, as you know, the truce came into being on July the 11th. De Valera and Arthur Griffiths went to London, and in the room in 10 Downing Street where the negotiations took place between Dev and Lloyd George, Lloyd George sat facing De Valera, and at his back there was a map of the world, and the whole of the British Empire was coloured in red, a bit like the map that Amy showed us, but all of it in red as a means of kind of intimidating, shall we say, De Valera. But at that stage, Lloyd George made clear 3 things. First of all, the status of Northern Ireland was non-negotiable. Secondly, there could not be a republic. And thirdly, the Irish would have to demonstrate allegiance to the British Crown. In fact, even the business of the Republic, Lloyd George put to De Valera that there is no word in Irish for republic, just as in Welsh. Of course, there is, we have to invent one. But historically, traditionally, he was absolutely right, there wasn't. De Valera said to him, and this is very significant, I cannot come to future negotiations to give away the Republic. After all, I am the president of the Republic. And Lloyd George said to him very significantly, send someone else. And as we know, that's exactly what De Valera did. Lloyd George wrote again, September the 29th, 1921, inviting an Irish legation to come to London for October the 11th, to ascertain how Ireland could continue to be associated with the British Empire. Even Michael Collins thought that by the very fact of accepting that worded invitation, the way it was worded, that was the first concession that Ireland made to Britain. In other words, to discuss how Ireland can continue to be associated with the British Empire. The Dáil had already decided in August who was going to go to London for future negotiations. Collins didn't want to go. He said, I'm a soldier, I'm not a politician. De Valera should go, De Valera should head it. But Dev did not go. Why? Well, because he knew he wasn't going to get a republic. He didn't want to be the fall guy. He didn't want to be the person who comes back and tells the Irish people, no, we do not have a republic. Of course, he gave a sort of convoluted idea about why he couldn't go, because he was the head of the Irish state, the president of the republic. The English king wasn't negotiating, so why should De Valera, as the equivalent of the king, go to these negotiations? But also he said, well, if anything goes wrong, if the negotiations break down, they can refer, I will then step in. But of course, as we know, this is kind of so much rhetoric, so much talk. The real reason is because he knew the British were not going to concede a republic. Nevertheless, he wrote out a very elaborate document about these people are going to plenipotentiaries of the Irish Republic to negotiate with His Majesty's ministers. De Valera, by a clever manipulation, didn't actually take that document. Although we often think of Collins as the head of the legation. In fact, he wasn't. It was Arthur Griffith. But Collins was the dominant person on the Irish side, without a doubt. And there's a certain sense in which his equivalent on the British side was actually Churchill, that kind of bulldog, shall we say, of British imperialism, a man determined that the empire was not going to break up. Under his watch, he was, after all, the colonial secretary at the time. The first major report that Griffith wrote back to De Valera on October the 30th of 1921 conveyed to Dev the intelligence from Lloyd George that nothing could be done to undermine the imperial status of Ireland. In other words, this was a non-negotiable so far as Lloyd George was concerned. Ireland would still have to be in the Commonwealth, in the Empire. It would have to be loyal to the Crown. De Valera, in his reply, took the view that, well, if the only alternative is war, that's what we will have to do. And the plenipotentiaries in London reacted very badly to that letter from Dev, saying that they were going to resign and go back to London because it tied their hands so far as negotiations were concerned. In the end, De Valera gave in and said, okay, you can discuss whatever Lloyd George brings up. But that cemented, shall we say, the distrust that already existed between De Valera on the one hand and Collins on the other. It's often said that the plenipotentiaries in London violated their instructions, that they did not refer the treaty back to Dublin. Now, that's true only in a very technical sense, that they didn't refer back the last draft of the treaty, but they had been in Dublin on the 2nd and 3rd of December of 1921. The treaty was signed, as you know, on the 6th of December. And there they had sustained negotiations with the cabinet about what was in the treaty. And most particularly, they had the draft of the Oath of Allegiance. It was drawn up by John Chartres, helped by a member of the British Civil Servants, and Collins tweaked it a bit. Tweaked it in such a way that the Oath of Allegiance, shall we say, was given to the constitution of the Irish Free State, but then a promise of faithfulness to George V and his successors. So that was a kind of, if you like, emphasizing that the primary allegiance, the primary loyalty of those going into the Dáil would be to the constitution of the Irish Free State, and only secondly, shall we say, to the King of England. Nevertheless, there were three issues so far as the treaty was concerned. The oath, as I've already talked about, the status of Northern Ireland, the status of Ulster, and then the idea of coastal defence. By the 4th of December, Collins made it clear to Lord George that the British had to make sure that the Northern Unionists accepted the principle of a fundamental unity of Ireland. And therefore, the Unionists would have to accept, shall we say, some sort of federated Irish state. And the whole business is that they hoped that given that, the Unionists in the end would be kind of reduced, shall we say, to a much smaller area of Northern Ireland, possibly only 2 counties, or 3 at most. Lloyd George undertook to send a message to Craig about this. Craig simply did not reply. He telegrammed him, he just didn't reply. Because it was raising this very issue about the totality of Ireland within the British Commonwealth. I'm running out of time, so just to say this. The treaty was signed 2:30 a.m. on the 6th of December 1921. You remember the famous quip exchange between Lord Birkenhead and Collins. Lord Birkenhead, I'm signing my political death warrant. Collins, I'm signing my actual death warrant. And that proved to be prophetic. The treaty was referred to the Dáil by the cabinet, the Dáil cabinet, with a tiny margin, 4-3. And then one has various kind of debates in the Dáil and so on and so forth. To cut a long story short, the Catholic Church in Ireland supported the treaty. That's absolutely clear. If you read any of the sermons given by bishops and priests between the end of the Dáil debates, December the 18th, and when they take up again early in January, most of the sermons are imploring the Irish people to accept the treaty. So this is an enormous boon for the pro-treatyites, the fact that the Catholic Church supported them. So far as Northern Ireland was concerned, interestingly enough, there was a good deal of support for the treaty in the north. Again, people accepting the kind of Collins rhetoric that it gives us freedom to attain freedom. Collins and Griffith went to the north, Fermanagh and Tyrone in particular, gave speeches. People who accepted this, and so on and so forth. The business of the threat from Lloyd George, I have 2 letters in my pocket to send one of them to Sir James Craig, either to say that you're accepting the treaty or there will be terrible war within 3 days. I mean, this seems to me, and again, I'm going out on a limb here, this seems to me to have a certain amount of bluff. Why? Because don't forget that during the period of negotiations, right from the time of the ceasefire in July, the IRA was rearming. Although Collins thought, by the time of the ceasefire, they didn't have enough arms to continue, but nevertheless, during the ceasefire, during the treaty negotiations, they were renegotiating. And as we've seen, the difficulties for Britain, so far as its empire was concerned, that was consuming lots of soldiers, lots of the army. So I think there was a certain amount of bluff on the part of Lloyd George, but nevertheless, it is a bluff that the Irish delegates accepted. And the treaty was enacted with tremendous and grave consequences, as we know, for the Irish Free State. Thank you very much. And I'll now hand over to Amy to give us the final presentation.
Hi, everybody. I am, really happy to be here with you all today virtually. The talks by Amy and Oliver just now were fascinating, and they have established this great foundation for me to build my part of this on. I'm a public historian, and as such, I'm always thinking about how people are engaging with the past and with the histories we develop outside of academia. Anniversaries, commemorations, memorializations help to create this intensely focused moment where the broader public has a heightened interest in a particular moment in history. Ireland and Northern Ireland have been working their way through the decade of centenaries and for a few years now. And public and academic interest has been focused on events like the Easter Rising, the Battle of the Somme, and the War for Independence. We're quickly moving towards a particularly challenging anniversary, that of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the formal partition of the island of Ireland, and then the Civil War. So today I want to talk with you briefly about the challenges and the opportunities that surround the commemoration of the Anglo-Irish Treaty on its 100th anniversary. So I'll start with some challenges, get some of the messy bits out of the way and hopefully end on a positive note. Traditionally, commemoration would have a clear message that seeks to unify. There can be a celebratory tone, and these occasions can often include parades or marches or educational programming and other events. A shared history or a shared past have been common messaging tools throughout the decade of centenary. And these approaches have worked really well for the most part, at least through the commemorations of the Rising. Post 1916, things get very complicated. The Rising is a violent action, and there are many deaths that happen as a result of that. But there is enough of a romantic notion at some points in the public view, at least, a revolution led by poets and musicians and teachers. And this romanticism, tied to the Rising allows a celebratory commemoration to be built around it. The commemoration of the Rising was handled with a great deal of maturity and a desire to create an inclusive narrative. There were parades and reenactments, memorializations, political speeches, and more that set a tone for that particular commemorative sphere. The question that poses an enormous challenge to us is, what is the clear message to build the Anglo-Irish Treaty commemorations around? Can there be a single focused message? I would argue that there can't be, and that any attempt to create a unifying message would likely be based on an oversimplification of the past or just bad, historic scholarship. Even a shallow dive into the history of 1921 and the Anglo-Irish Treaty would reveal an Ireland that is politically polarized, recovering from the War of Independence or in the War of Independence, and establishing itself on the world stage. When Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith return with the treaty, the political polarization only intensifies. The polarization breaks into the pro and anti-treaty sides of government, which end up leading to the Civil War. For the purpose of commemoration in 2021, there can't be a unified message around the treaty because there is no unified past. There's no celebratory moment where you can pin a simple message of victory. As if the events of the past were not complicated enough, the politics, polarization, and social tensions of today heavily influence the way that we approach commemoration. The reality of commemoration is that they are deeply rooted, in the politics of today. They reflect the current moment that they are created in and are built to serve the needs of today, not the needs of 1916, 1921, 22, and so on. In 2021, the circumstances that are impacting the way we approach the treaty commemorations are things we hear about in the news every day. Pre-existing social tensions that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Brexit, the debate around a potential border poll, and so many more realities, modern realities that the commemorations are being filtered through. The political environment of today and the complexities of the history we're dealing with create a challenging landscape for those wishing to commemorate the treaty publicly. The treaty is not just one moment, and the people who are talking about commemorating the treaty, it's unlikely that they are talking about calling attention, to the moment that the document itself is signed. They're wanting to reflect on a series of actions and consequences that are being remembered and interpreted. The treaty doesn't happen in a vacuum. So part of commemorating of treaty commemoration is examining the impact and legacy of that. And this will look different in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But it's likely that there will be a lot of strong opposing positions, being voiced on, any side of this. The tone that is set around these commemorations will follow through to the discussions about the Civil War, the creation of Northern Ireland, violence along the border, discord between political parties in Northern Ireland and the Republic, and much more. Despite the clear challenges, there is a path forward. From my perspective, historians and public historians have a big role to play here. If we're going to commemorate and engage with the past, it's worth doing so by recognizing that there is nothing simple about the time in history that we are seeking to commemorate. The times were divisive. You can't simplify the Free State as one entity and Northern Ireland as another. You can't really cleanly divide along lines of pro-treaty and anti-treaty. And for that matter, you can't make a clean cut through the identities of Irish and British citizenry. Recognizing the complexities of the past is the first step to allowing a diverse perspectives to be heard, and for recognizing the nuances of the narrative. In the article, Public History and the Challenges of Commemoration, Ed Lenenthal makes this case for scrapping the old model of the celebratory model of commemoration altogether. And he argues that commemoration, rather than creating this triumphant or celebratory tone, that we're normally familiar with, we should seek to push back against the accepted narratives. The commemoration of the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty is an opportunity to challenge the mythology and misconceptions of this era. We can work to create space for the existing scholarship to be addressed, interpret that scholarship, and ideally, create a space for the discourse to grow. When you have so many people, traditional academics, local historians, people who are living the legacy of the treaty, and others all focused on this discourse for the specific time period, it's almost certain that a new angle will be introduced. We see this. This happened around the 1916 commemorations. The 100th anniversary created a renewed interest in the topic, and with that came new paths of historical inquiry, new primary sources, and efforts to illuminate previously misrepresented or underappreciated experiences. The commemoration of the treaty is an opportunity to challenge ideas of the monolithic Catholic identities at the time. We can call attention to the roles women played post-treaty. We can start conversation about Ireland's role in empire, and really just explore new aspects and stories of the island during and after the treaty was signed. This is where public historians and academic historians really have a chance to shine and lend their perspectives to commemoration. The complexities of the 1921 treaty, create this opportunity for historians, archivists, and curators to broaden the narrative and paint a picture of the time through educational programming, exploration of primary sources, highlighting material culture. We can create spaces where people see themselves and their ancestors represented in the histories and encourage active critical engagement with the past. In my perspective, a successful commemoration of the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty recognizes that a unifying or simplistic message does a disservice to the complexities of the time. Based on the tensions of the time and the events that follow, a celebratory tone is not appropriate. Instead, a commemoration should utilize the skills of historians, public historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, and others to create a public dialogue that is based in well-researched interpretation and leans into the nuances of the diverse narratives at the time. Thank you all for listening to me. I will pass this along to the ambassador, who's going to take the spotlight now.
To unmute myself now. Well, first of all, that was fascinating. I really appreciated those three papers, which covered a lot of ground, and in fact, they they managed to be almost completely devoid of overlap, which is always an important achievement when you've got three excellent speakers who know a lot about the subject matter of today's event. And but the three papers were complementary without in any way overlapping. So we got a very full picture of both the context, the international background, the negotiations themselves, and then the commemoration of those negotiations. And let me just say a few words on those subjects. Firstly, I want to commend Amy on the way she situated this Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, because I'd always made the point, I made it many times before, including in this series of talks, that the great Irish achievement in 1921 and 22 was to secure independence, not from a failed empire, not from one of the losers of the First World War. The other countries that emerged in Europe in the wake of the First World War all emerged because essentially the empires to which they belonged fell apart. And that's how the Baltic states emerged. That's how Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the Kingdom of Serbs, Slovenes and Croats and Slovenes, and so forth. They all emerged because effectively the multinational entities to which they had belonged, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Turkish Empire, all basically came to grief either just before or in the wake of the First World War. So there was essentially no freedom to struggle for, because it just came about because you had this collapse of the previous policies that had prevailed for so long and had controlled those parts of Europe for so long. And in the Irish case, we managed to break free from one of the victorious powers from the Great War, a country that had won, that had been victorious in the most awesome and the most violent struggle in probably the entirety of human history, if you count all the casualties and the amount of munitions that were used during World War I. It was an atrocious war, and the fact that Britain emerged victorious from it was certainly put Britain in a very strong position. And Ireland ought not to have been able to prevail against a country that had just gone through this and succeeded in one of the greatest struggles, one of the most violent struggles in human history. But it did. And I think our first speaker, Amy, I think broadened that perspective of mine, which I've had for a long time, by making the point that actually not only was Britain victorious in the First World War and therefore one of the strong powers that emerged from the war, but it was also a rising power, not a fading power, not even just a victorious power, but one that was on the rise. And she reminds us of the fact that Britain actually acquired significant new territories in the aftermath of the First World War. So that, I think, puts an even further positive gloss on the extent of the achievement of those Irish individuals who conducted a war of independence against a rising imperial power, a power that was strengthening itself rather than, although it had been weakened, of course, economically. It had been overtaken by the United States in economic terms, and it was obviously indebted to a large degree. We'll come to that in a minute. So why did Ireland manage this achievement? It seems to me that there are two reasons for it. Because clearly, Britain could have deployed sufficient power in Ireland to crush any level of Irish resistance that might have arisen. And there were only 1,500 people who were active in the Irish Volunteers or the IRA during the War of Independence. So it could have crushed the rebellion. But it couldn't do that because it had lost the will to do it, because they knew that this would cause problems for them domestically, because while British people were maybe willing to make the sacrifice of the First World War, would they really have been willing to see 100,000 troops deployed to crush the entire population of Ireland with overwhelming military force? The answer is no, probably no, and that's what the politicians had to factor in to their calculations. And the second reason, of course, is that internationally it would have been disastrous for Britain. Having won a war and having, if you like, in a way, won the propaganda battle, because they managed to point the finger at Germany successfully for the way they had crushed Belgium. So then, in that context, for Britain to have crushed Ireland would, I think, have made them into international pariahs, and I think they knew that, and they knew that in particular they would have to face the music here in the United States, where Irish Americans would certainly cause serious problems for relations between the United States and Britain, which, of course, from the British point of view, became all the more important after the First World War, because America had displayed, at least shown the first signs of it becoming the premier global power by intervening in the First World War and by effectively tipping the balance in favor of Britain and France in that war. Going on to Oliver Rafferty's presentation, I want to say that he's brought home another important factor here, which we should always bear in mind, and that is, the greasy till of costs. The fact is that governments have to concern themselves with costs, and you use the figure there of 20 million a year. Doesn't sound like it's only small change these days, but in the context of budgets at that time, this was a significant cost, especially for a country which, as you say, was 1 billion in debt to the United States because of the war debts that it had built up. So again, the cost of the war had to be borne in mind. And you also made the point, I think, very, very perceptively, that the number of troops that would have been required to have crushed the rebellion in Ireland would have been such as to handicap the British in their capacity to be active in other parts of the world. So there was a serious military challenge in Ireland, and that challenge could only be faced up to by neglecting other aspects of Britain's role internationally, which were more important to Britain at that time because of the opportunities they saw, first of all, to expand the empire by acquiring, through the various treaties in the early 20s, additional territories in the Middle East, but also, of course, vitally protecting what they saw as the jewel in the crown, which was the empire, or the empire in India, which became the obsession for British politicians in the period after, until indeed India asserted itself and followed Ireland's path in asserting itself and securing its independence. The other point that I want to take up is Oliver Rafferty's point that about the the delegation and De Valera and not going and all of that. That's the big issue. One of the biggest topics in 20th century Irish history is probably, why did De Valera not go to London? And as someone who's been involved in negotiations, I do sympathize with the delegation in London, because I can remember times when I was involved with the foreign minister, and the Taoiseach had to be consulted at home on an issue that had to be resolved that evening. And I can remember times when the Taoiseach, very unwilling at a remove from Brussels, to make the concessions that the foreign minister regarded as being essential, because of course the foreign minister was on the spot and was actually dealing with the situation on the ground and able to assess how much we could actually achieve and where we had to draw a line and agree to whatever compromise was available. So I'm very, and of course in those days and now, it's all possible to be done by Zoom calls and telephone. Wasn't that easy for the delegation in London at that time to make sure that they were totally on the same wavelength as De Valera and others were in Dublin. And I think the other thing I want to say is that the Irish revolutionary movement of the period between 1960 and 1922 was a big tent. It was a very big tent. I mean, it contained people who clearly had been supporters of the Irish Party before the First World War. It included people who were dual monarchists, who were members of the original Sinn Féin. It included some people who were on the left politically, or were socialist, or members of the Citizen Army originally. And then it included people who were drawn into politics through the Gaelic League, to the idealism of the Gaelic League and so forth. So you had a lot of different people who were drawn together into this movement that looked like it was a very unified movement for the 5 years it was involved in this life and death struggle against Britain to secure Irish independence. But when you got close to the finishing line, when you got to the 5-yard line, if I may use a football analogy, then you started to see different tactical considerations coming into play, and that's not unusual. And then the final point I want to make, and I'm conscious that I've used up most of my time. The point I want to make is about commemorations. The point Catherine made in her paper is absolutely correct. History may be about the past, although it's often about the present as well, as we know, because our views of the past are conditioned by our lives in the present. But commemoration is definitely about the present, because it happens in the here and now. We have these events, we have these gatherings, we have these. I mean, my experience of commemorations is mainly derived from my time in London. I was in London for the 2016 commemorations of the Easter Rising. And I managed to commemorate the Easter Rising in Britain quite a few times, giving talks and attending events which were dedicated to remembering the Easter Rising. That was possible because another event took place in 1916, which provided a natural counterweight to the commemoration of the Easter Rising. And that was the Battle of the Somme, where thousands of Irish men fought and died in that battle. So I found it useful to be able to do the two things side by side. I always made a point, of course, everyone I spoke to, that the main strand of Irish history that I'm responsible for and that I relate to runs through the General Post Office in 1916 to the first Dáil in 1919 and on to the foundation of the Irish Free State. And that the other strands, the strand that brought people like Tom Kettle and Francis Ledwidge to fight and die on the Western Front, that's a subsidiary strand, but you can't ignore it. And I think commemorations, when I look back, I can remember the 1916 commemoration in 1966, and it was so different from the 2016 commemoration. Why? Because in 1966, some of the people who fought in 1916 were still alive, and their children were still alive. So the hand of those who were present at that time loomed over that commemoration in 1966, which meant that it was a different type of commemoration. And the great advantage of 2016 was that we could have a more nuanced commemoration, which was capable of dealing with the complexities of that period. And I'm confident, but I think we have work to do, that we can successfully commemorate the establishment of Northern Ireland, which will be commemorated, of course, by one tradition in Northern Ireland. But I think we can be respectful about it, and we can recognize its importance while at the same time, acknowledging or recognizing or stressing the fact that it was a big blow to nationalist Ireland, and particularly to nationalists in Northern Ireland, which took a long time to recover. And I think we can even manage to navigate the different interpretations of the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, and indeed of the Civil War, which started in 1922. Those are the trickiest subjects of all, in my view. But I think on the basis of our experience to date, I'm of the view that we can actually navigate these next few years and get to a point where we will have got through the decade of commemorations and will have enhanced people's understanding of that period. And that's the aim of the Farther Shore, this series of events called the Farther Shore, which I've been involved in now for the last few months and will go on for another few months. The idea is to try to create a rounded, complex, nuanced understanding and interpretation and analysis of the events of the period between 1919 and 1921. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Mulhall. And we've had lots of questions coming in the chat. And I think, unsurprisingly, many of the questions are relating to events today, or they're concerned about the border poll and the events, the violence in the north. But there's also, I mean, one question that's being posed, and I want to pose this to all the speakers, is a historical question. I know, and maybe for historians, it's the kind of question that drive you guys nuts, which is like, it's a kind of one of those counterfactual questions, which is like, could partition have been avoided? Was there any, like, is there any political configuration that could have given Ireland some degree of independence and kept the counties in the north, or the those people who identified as British in the north? And maybe I can add like a rider to that, is like, because this is what we're trying to, I think this is what the Irish government and the Irish in the south are trying to grapple with at the moment, which is there any sort of political configuration or new imagination of an Ireland going forward that could possibly get, loyalists or unionists on board, or some form of a united Ireland in a new sort of configuration? There are many other questions, but maybe we can just start with that. And maybe Oliver. Sorry, Oliver, because you're from the north, I grew up in Belfast. I did my master's in Queen's. I think it'd be great to get your perspective as somebody who grew up in the north, because often Irish Americans and those in the south, our understanding of these spaces is not as deft or subtle as we like.
So I hope I'm unmuted. I am, okay. So there are a couple of things. One, could the border have been avoided? It seems to me that in the circumstances of 1921, no, because don't forget that it had already been introduced under the terms of the Government of Ireland Act of 1920. In fact, Walter Long had done this. He was the principal architect of that bill. It could not have, you could not envisage an Ireland at that point without a border. But Lloyd George convinced the Irish delegates in London that the Boundary Commission, under the terms of the treaty, would indeed adjust the border. And this is precisely why even people in the north accepted the treaty, because they had this fixed idea conveyed to them by Collins and Griffith, that the Boundary Commission would so adjust the border that Northern Ireland would be unviable as a political institution, economically and politically, because it would be so reduced, possibly even to just two counties, Antrim and Down, that it would just be impossible. And this was the basis upon which the treaty, so far as the North was concerned, was acceptable. Of course, they were, the Catholics, particularly the bishops, were deeply concerned about the issue of education. And would Catholic schools, would the Catholic Church's patronage of schools, would that be acknowledged and accepted? And Lloyd George, again, falsely gave the impression that, yes, guarantees would be written into the structure so that Catholic education would be protected. Whereas, in fact, we know that a number of Catholic schools actually associated themselves, this is in the north, associated themselves with the Ministry of Education in Dublin. And Collins, so long as he lived, paid the salaries of Catholic teachers in the north. Cosgrave, when he became president of the Executive Council, made it absolutely clear, no, that is not going to happen. We're not going to do that. They'll have to look to the Minister of Education in Northern Ireland, and that is what happened. So far as the present circumstances are concerned, it seems to me that there is an analogy with the era of the treaty, and it is this: Ulster Unionists do not want to have anything to do with the Irish Republic, the Irish Free State as it then was, the Irish Republic as it is today. They've made this clear time and time and time again. They don't want to have anything to do with the free Ireland with the 26 counties. Although one has to say that there was one thing that has radically changed to make the unionist position less coherent today than it was in 1921, and that is the position of the Catholic Church. The fear was, you know, the old thing, even under the first Home Rule Bill, the second Home Rule Bill, home rule is Rome rule. Now you can argue a case for, to some extent, I don't want to press it too much, that yes, certainly under the terms of the 37 Constitution, the ethos of the Free State, the ethos of the Republic was deeply Catholic. And you could understand why Northern Protestants looking at the Free State, looking at the Republic, would shy away from it. But frankly, and speaking as a Catholic priest myself, the power of institutional Catholicism in Ireland has simply collapsed. So that in many ways, the Irish Republic is like nominally Catholic countries in Europe, like Belgium or France, where the Catholic ethos of those countries counts for very little indeed. So it seems to me that we are in a somewhat different situation today than we were in the 1920s. But the basic position is unionists don't want to have anything to do with the 26 counties. And that is the problem, frankly.
Could I just...
Yeah, sorry, Dan. Yeah, sorry, Ambassador. Yeah.
Just to say that, yeah, I mean, look, on your first question, my answer is the kind of the virtual history answer, which is that had the First World War been delayed until 1915, 1916, I could imagine a situation where some form of unified version of some modified but nonetheless all-island version of home rule might eventually have been implemented in 1914-15. And then if the war had broken out and the whole island had kind of, you know, enthusiastically joined the war effort together, you could imagine that could have sort of could have sealed some kind of relationship between the two traditions in a way that would have maybe but obviously the way things worked out, you know, you had the you know, the Easter Rising became the kind of focal point for nationalists, and then the sacrifice on the Somme became the kind of the blood covenant for Northern Unionists, and of course that just took the two parts of the island on a different journey. As far as the future is concerned, I've been around long enough now to know that you never take the future for granted. You never sort of believe you can predict the future properly. And for example, who would have imagined that Ireland would have voted in favor of same-sex marriage? 62% to 38%. And this, in a way, illustrates the point that Professor Rafferty has made against the strong opposition of the Catholic Church in a number of years ago. And then, you had the Right to Life amendment being withdrawn from the Constitution by 66 to 34. I mean, like, that would have been inconceivable even 10, 20 years ago. And that's why I don't make any predictions about how opinion in Northern Ireland, or indeed on the island of Ireland, is going to evolve in the next 10, 20 years. That's why I used to say I wouldn't see United Ireland in my lifetime. I no longer say that now, not because I'm any younger, I'm older, but because I've seen so much of an acceleration and changes in opinions that have occurred very dramatically, that I don't want to predict how things might evolve in terms of opinion on the island of Ireland regarding the future constitutional shape of our island.
I don't know if I could respond to any of this, but I think there are a couple points in the chat that I'd really like to highlight. One from Brian Traynor and another from Mary O'Carroll about the complexity of Irish identity and identities in general. So, I mean, I think part of the problem is that often, and this brings up what Catherine was talking about, in so many of our discussions, we can fall back on some narratives that really pit nationalists against unionists, and we're kind of stuck in that strain. In the chat, I put a couple of quotations from some very eminent 20th century Irish historians, that so much of the way we talk about it is precisely, and so much of the way that those in favor of home rule had thought about it was to think of it as one nation. And then we moved on to the two nations model, right? They're unionists as a form of national identity, and then against nationalists who have a national identity. What's fascinating in terms of what's happening in Europe more broadly, in Britain, in Ireland, is the kind of splintering of identities. But part of the question, I think, before all of us now is how can we help support political conversations that embrace, and this goes exactly to what we've just been hearing, a multiplicity of identities, and political formulations which allow for that, and in you know, the idea of a democratic formulation. What's happening in Scotland, for example, you know, the kind of strange devolution within Britain itself. You know, there's a lot at play, and some of it too, and I will just say, I mean, I think the way that the English Conservative Party, and I say English very deliberately here, they have very much comported themselves as interested in very narrow English and in fact London-centric issues, have been extraordinary in terms of their vision of where they want to take Britain and Ireland more generally. But I think as much as we can think about, again, the complexities of these identities and how do we push for and consider and include the multiplicity of identities, I think the more we can look critically at then when we pit kind of either a singular national identity or even that idea of two nations, maybe we can move beyond even that bifurcation.
Katie, you know, I think what I heard from your talk was, you know, what we need to avoid is triumphalist sort of commemorations, like, you know, let's celebrate the fact that Ireland, the Irish Free State won independence. And like, I kept on thinking the way Oliver finished his talk, which is like, let's remember what, you know, this treaty led to a civil war, led to partition, led to like, you know, there's as much to grieve over the Anglo-Irish Treaty as there is to celebrate. But now that we're here, Katie, like, what would be a way we could talk about these events that would not further polarize? Say I keep on thinking if there's an audience of loyalists in here, or as Mary O'Carroll brought up so wisely, a lot like that constituency in the north that now actively describe themselves as non-aligned. Like, if that audience was here, how could we talk about 1921 in a way that wouldn't alienate them or polarize them?
So I think a big part of it, it's kind of getting rid of the ideas of like victor or victim narratives altogether, to try to create a conversation around the what we understand is like the factual history of this, because we can debate it all day, but it's not going to change what happened. Two things that we should really think about are, well, I guess the one thing that we should really think about is not trying to retreat to an idealized version of the past in order to fix whatever problems or issues we're dealing with today. That's not going to fix anything. It's going to most likely alienate more people. So the idea of having inclusive conversations is just realizing that there are different experiences of these moments. We can talk about what it was to be a unionist in the new Free State and to not know what your life was going to be like under this new government, or to be a Catholic when the border is drawn and, you know, be unsure of what your life looks like there. And you could really humanize the stories. So you're not talking about, you know, abstract ideas of what this could look like or what this should look like at the top. You're talking about people's lived experiences. And we do have incredible sources from these times. So much work has been done along the lines of the border communities and looking at what the lived experiences of those people were. So whenever we get the chance to kind of humanize these big moments in history, we can take that opportunity and really kind of create areas where people can empathize with people who are unlike themselves, even if their experience is not reflective in that individual's life. You can still kind of recognize the humanity of the individuals who were experiencing this. So that would be my recommendation, is always to bring things down to a very human level of, these are people who are experiencing this, these are people who are living with the consequences, and they have a huge array of experience: loyalist, unionist, nationalist, and so on and so forth. And I think that really creates a space for conversation that starts with a place of humility as opposed to, maybe agitation.
Ambassador Mulhall, can I pose the same question of, like, if we consider this conversation as like being directed at an audience of those in the North who consider themselves British, what can we do on these kind of reflections to make them feel recognized, less polarized? Have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, at the moment, the first thing we should do is resolve this issue that has brought so many people onto the streets of Belfast in the last few weeks, and the violence we've seen there, which has been very worrying, especially at the start of the kind of, the summer period, when there's always a rising tension because of the marching season. So I think it's very important to sort of calm down the atmosphere surrounding the Northern Ireland Protocol. I mean, frankly, this idea of a border in the Irish Sea is total nonsense, right? There is no border in the Irish Sea. A border has a particular connotation. It's the vision of a border is where you pass through and you show your passport, and you only get in if you're entitled to be in that place. The arrangements that are provided for in the protocol purely have to do with the movement of goods. Nobody traveling across the Irish Sea, either by ferry or by plane, will even know that there's any arrangements in place, because for people traveling, there is no implication at all in this protocol. So it is quite wrong, and I think quite risky for politicians to keep talking about there being a border in the Irish Sea. There's not a border in the Irish Sea. There are a series of arrangements. Now, those arrangements could be made to work more smoothly, and that's what's being worked on at the moment between the EU and the UK government. And my hope would be that they will come up with a series of moves that smooth out some of the rough edges of the way the protocol has operated in the last few months, and that hopefully that can help to assuage. But if there's an effort to try and get rid of the protocol, then that's a bridge too far, because that will create a real standoff between the UK and the European Union, which will damage the entire relationship, because they've just agreed this protocol only last December, after all. As far as other things are concerned, I mean, look, the Irish government has just initiated a new program called the Shared Island Initiative. Now, this is not designed to be the kind of, the kind of wedge that sort of, breaks the constitutional unity of the United Kingdom. No, this is designed to be an effort to develop links between North and South, which will be productive for both parts of the island. And the government has set aside a significant sum of money. I think it's about 500 million euros for funding projects in this area in the coming years. And that's an effort to try to create a sort of a shared space for people on the island of Ireland, not because we wanted to lead on to a United Ireland or a referendum, but because we think that's the right thing to do. But that's what that's what our government's trying to do at the moment, is to sort of reach out and to try and demonstrate to people in Northern Ireland that there's no hostility, there's no agenda, there's no aggressive sort of policy towards them. This is simply what's happened with the protocol is unfortunate, but it's a byproduct of a misfortunate move on the part of the British people to opt to leave the European Union, which happened to be one of the the supporting the anchors which anchored peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland.
Oliver.
Yes, so I'd like to say that I very much agree with what the ambassador has said. The idea of a border down the Irish Sea is a nonsense. But the fact remains this, that 2 years ago, Boris Johnson gave an address at the annual meeting of the Democratic Unionist Party, in which he assured the DUP that he would not do this, that he would not have trade restrictions between Britain and Northern Ireland. And of course, the fact is that he did this. And so they feel, the Unionists, rightly in a sense, feel deeply let down by the British and by Boris Johnson in particular. So I agree entirely with what the ambassador has to say. But if I might revert to a previous observation that he made, with which I do not agree, I'm sorry to say, and that is this, that had the First World War happened in 1915 rather than 1914, there would have been a kind of a possibility for a different scenario in Ireland, whereby the country may have been united. It seems to me if the war had not broken out in the summer of 1914, we would have had a civil war in Ireland between the UVF on the one hand and the Irish Volunteers on the other. And not only that, by that stage, the UVF knew that the British Army would not move against them, because that was the whole point of the Curragh Mutiny in March of 1914. Now the Unionists are assured that we have the British Army on our side, which would have made them more vehement, more aggressive, more willing to take on the Irish Volunteers. And it seems to me that we might have had, and this is kind of utterly speculative and alternative history, we might have had a war in Ireland akin to the Second Boer War, where, if you remember, 33,000, I think, Boers fought a quarter of a million British soldiers. And it seems to me that is the possibility that would have happened, or would have a possible opening, shall we say, a possible alternative history for Ireland if the First World War had not begun in the summer of 1914.
Everybody, I'm aware that we're running short of time. Can I just ask the ambassador one final question? Because it's been coming up in the chat a lot. Like, at this point, do you think a discussion of a border poll is like helpful or unproductive, or do you have any thoughts on that? Or,
well, look, I mean, a border poll is provided for in the Good Friday Agreement, and my guide, my guardrails for my analysis of Northern Ireland and the future scenarios there has the Good Friday Agreement as its key element. So I adhere to that part of the Good Friday Agreement, which says that when it becomes apparent that there may be a majority or a possibility of a majority in favour in Northern Ireland of a united Ireland, that then a border poll should be called, and that the two governments would respect the outcome of that poll. I think which they would certainly that's what's in the the agreement, and I'm assuming that both governments would adhere to their obligations under the agreement. So the question is, does that evidence currently exist? Well, I would say that there's the view of our government is that this is not the time for a referendum on a united Ireland. Of course, we adhere to the principle that yes, at some point there may very well be, and if you look at there may well be a basis for a border poll. And if you look at the opinion polls, there was one published last night by the Spotlight program, which showed 49% against United Ireland, 43% in favour, which is a very relatively high number, compared with what we've seen recently. My own suspicion is that Brexit has made a difference in that it's in the past there were a lot of people with a nationalist background who said, well, yeah, but I don't want to push it now, and that those people, because of Brexit, are maybe more willing, to move into the camp of saying, yes, I want a united Ireland, rather than I'll wait and bide my time. So I think Brexit probably has changed, and I think a lot of the future will depend on how Brexit works out in practice. Will it be a relatively smooth process, or will it be economically damaging? Will it pose genuine problems for the UK as a whole? Will it give rise to tensions in Scotland, which may lead to a referendum there? So all these things are not within the gift of the Irish government, of anyone in Ireland, but they may well affect the context in which this issue is being looked at in the future.
And one other thing I'll add before turning it over to, we joked before this meeting that Consul General Orla Keane was going to tie everything up with a nice neat bow in a couple of minutes, which I know is an unenviable task. But the one last point I'd make is, it isn't the government's current position that that's a good idea. And let me say, personally, I agree so strongly, but we are facing the strong possibility we will have a government led by Mary Lou McDonald, who will believe that that poll is the right thing to do. And then I have to think about, and I'm sure we're all thinking about, yeah, how about if there is 43% unionists who are opposed to that? We're going to impose a united Ireland on that kind of number of people, in the next number of years. It's just, I find that sobering to chew on and to think about. But it's been all this is a product of how fascinating these talks have been. Once again, before you leave, Ambassador Mulhall, I want to thank you for gracing LMU with your presence again, your thoughts, and all the panelists. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to the Consul General, Orla King.
Thank you very much, Dermot, and thanks to all the panelists for a fascinating discussion today. I know you know already that I'm not going to try and sum things up and tie them in a neat bow, but I think I would like to hark back to a phrase that Amy used in her presentation at the beginning of the discussion, which is complexity of identity. And I think that that's something that has come through very strongly today. We look back to 1921 and find that in 2021, we're still looking at these complexity of identity questions, but I also think it's a theme that's very resonant for all sorts of situations around the world. And as a relative new arrival to the US, I think grappling with that complexity of identity is something that's very resonant for those of us who are living in the US at the moment. So I think it's just to illustrate the richness of these discussions that we have, looking back, and how they can resonate with us today. I'm so glad to see so many people at this event and so many familiar faces, including from our Irish community in Southern California. As many of you know, we're relatively new arrivals here in the Consulate in LA. We were officially opened in September 2019. And we're very grateful to Loyola Marymount University for the incredible support that we have received and the partnership that we have with the Irish Studies Programme. So I'd like to thank Dr. Robin Crabtree for being here with us today. I'd also like to particularly thank Dermot Ryan, the Director of the Irish Studies Programme, who has been so instrumental and has put so much work into today's event. And I'd like to thank all of you for attending. There is another farther shore discussion coming up on Friday, hosted by our consulate in Austin. I've put the details of that in the chat box, and I just encourage all of you to stay engaged with these issues. You know, our history in many ways is our present for us in Ireland, so it's good to see the engagement continuing, and I suppose to ask ourselves to maybe challenge some of the narratives that we might have grown up with or we might have heard in our respective communities,